Agenda 2030 is about transforming the world. Sustainable development is about transforming how our economies function. Our economies and our global economy that knits together the national economies through trade and finance and technology flows does a pretty good job of creating economic growth and wealth, but it does not do such a good job of creating social inclusion, that is, shared prosperity. It has not been great at ending extreme poverty in certain parts of the world, and it certainly has not looked after the natural environment. We're in the midst of 3 mega environmental crises right now. One is human-induced climate change. The second is the massive destruction of biological diversity and the weakening of how the ecosystems function. And the third crisis is mega pollution, air and water pollution, oceans filled with litter and microplastics that are now in the fish and in the whole marine food cycle. So we have to transform how the economies of our world function. And that's not just about fighting poverty or transforming the economies in poor countries. The Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a universal agenda. They call on every government in the world to take transformative measures so that every part of the world is functioning sustainably. And we will see when we look at the data that some countries are doing a pretty good job on these 3 dimensions, the economic, the social, and the environmental. Others are doing a good job on 1 or 2 of them, but quite poorly on others. But no country right now is fully achieving sustainable development. Some countries are in rather desperate shape, and they need the most help. Well, what kind of transformations are needed to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? In this course, we will focus on 6 big transformations that are needed. Transformations that, if properly implemented country by country and on a global scale, will put national economies and the world economy as a whole on a path to sustainable development. The first of these transformations is around education, skills, and jobs. That is, that we make sure that every country has an education system thought about quite broadly, so it includes formal education, adult education, ongoing lifetime learning, school-to-work programs, and other aspects of skill building that creates societies that are well educated, that have the skills for the 21st century, and that can participate in innovation. By doing so, economies can achieve economic growth, that is, further economic progress, improvements in material conditions. Good jobs will be generated, and economies will become more innovative so that economies can create themselves new technologies, new business approaches, new business processes to improve human well-being. The second big dimension of transformation is health. We want a healthful society. In fact, health and more generally well-being. So physical health, mental health, and communities that are peaceful and thriving. This too requires significant transformations. In some places in the world, even the most rudimentary healthcare is not available for very poor people. And this leads to millions of children dying every year before their 5th birthday because they're living in places without even a rudimentary healthcare system. In other places, such as my country, the United States, there's a tremendous expenditure on healthcare, but it's unevenly accessed. Some people do not have access, cannot afford access to healthcare that they need. And even with that big and expensive healthcare system, there are some huge crises of well-being, rising suicide rates, rising substance abuse, addictions to opioids, for example, epidemics of depression. And so one can have a healthcare system but have a well-being crisis. So transformation number 2 is about health and well-being. Transformation number 3 seeks to address and urgently needs to address human-made climate change, which is caused by our use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas that when burned release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide has a property of trapping heat in the earth and warming the planet. And our economies use other chemicals and material processes that release other kinds of gases that also cause global warming, so-called greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide and some other industrial chemicals. So we need a transformation of our energy systems and our industrial processes and other contributors to greenhouse gases so that we stop the dangers of human-induced climate change. Energy sector transformation is fundamental, moving from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar power, hydroelectric power, in some places nuclear energy, geothermal energy, ocean power. These are kinds of primary energy sources that do not emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and therefore do not warm the planet and cause human-induced climate change in the same way that our fossil fuels do. We need to turn wastes into new kinds of inputs for products or make products that are biodegradable rather than plastics that end up polluting the environment massively. The fourth transformation is sustainable land use, especially around agriculture. It turns out that agriculture itself, the way we grow food or forests or pasture land, the way we fish, can have devastating effects on the environment, especially if you clear forests to make a new pasture land or new cropland. You massively destroy the habitats for millions of species on the planet. Chemicals used in agriculture, such as pesticides, can be terribly polluting. The chemical fertilizers, such as nitrogen-based fertilizers and phosphorus-based fertilizers, can lead to massive runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus molecules that end up creating big pollution when they aggregate at the coastlines. So we need a transformation of how we grow food all over the world, how we manage forests, how we manage fisheries, so that we're not destroying the very biodiversity that we share the planet with and that we depend on for our food supply and our well-being. Sustainable food and land use, therefore, is the fourth big transformation. The fifth big transformation is to make our cities work sustainably. Many cities today are massive sprawls of pollution, traffic jams, often urban-borne diseases like dengue fever, crises of water supplies that have led to huge water scarcity in major cities of the world during drought periods, such as in Cape Town, South Africa, or Sao Paulo, Brazil. We need smart cities, smart in terms of transport, in terms of buildings, in terms of energy use, that we're able to make cities that are livable, healthful, walkable, green, pleasant places to live, safe from the kind of environmental threats that now imperil so many urban livers around the world. And we need to make sure that urban residents have access to transport to reach their jobs and have the skills and the ability to find good livelihoods in the cities. So smart, sustainable cities and all of the transport infrastructure around that is the fifth major transformation. The sixth and final of the grand transformations that will be necessary to achieve sustainable development is to harness in a positive way the digital revolution that is all around us. We know from our smartphones and the internet and social media, we're living in a new world. Our lives are being transformed by artificial intelligence, by robotics, by 3D manufacturing, which is molecular assembly of products using the internet to transmit the underlying data for the manufacturing. The genomics revolution is a digital information revolution that is transforming healthcare and drug discovery. Well, there are so many potential positive aspects of this digital revolution that every society must, as a core part of its transformative strategy, build access to worldwide information through the internet, to broadband connectivity, to using artificial intelligence. But this transformation also comes with many, many perils, because artificial intelligence can be misused. It can end up with new kinds of warfare, cyber warfare or autonomous weapons. The internet can be not only a vehicle for transmitting information, but a vehicle, of course, for spying and surveillance, for loss of privacy, for manipulation of politics, such as occurred in the United States in the 2016 presidential elections and in other parts of the world as well. So these new technologies really challenge us, and the idea of a transformation to a digital world that is productive and secure and protects our human rights, doesn't defeat them through surveillance and loss of property, is the sixth of these great transformations. What do all of these transformations have in common? Well, first, they are major systemic changes. They involve changes of technology, of standard operating practices, of investments in physical capital and in human, in other words, skill capital and knowledge capital. Second, they all require long-term investments. Nothing about the Sustainable Development Goals, nothing about the transformations of energy systems or digital technologies or sustainable land use or sustainable cities or the other transformations will be met in a year or two or even 5 or even 10 years. These are long-term transformations. We may get to 2030 to reach the SDGs, but we're still going to have transformation required after that. All of them require a complementarity of public action and private action. None of this can be left only to government or only to the private sector. All of these transformations require more financing. You have to pay for the investments in smart cities, the investments in the digital revolution, the investments in renewable energy, the investments in sustainable land use, the investments in improved quality education, the investments in healthcare. All of these require financing. And in general, the financing will be complex, involving a mix of budgetary resources, of borrowing, of private capital market investments, of individual household investments. So this is a quite complex financing picture. And all of these transformations require a set of complementary tools. There's no one trick, no one economic policy that says, aha, I put a price on carbon, now we're on the path to a safe energy system. It's not so simple, unfortunately. Everything will require changes of taxation, of pricing, of political institutions, of how our governments are organized, of how civil society acts, of the ethics of a new era, for instance, the ethical underpinnings of social media. So we will require a set of economic, political, and social instruments for each of these transformations. This is deep systemic change. It's one of the exciting but core aspects of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.